Two of the Pretty Little Liars stars, Tammin Sursok and Lindsey have recently faced backlash over their new podcast, which they called A Pretty Little Podcast.
Are you ready for tomorrow?
You bet I am. Got a secret, can you keep?
They played Paige and Jen on the show and announced that on this podcast they're going to rewatch every episode of Pretty Little Liars, chat with old cast and crew members, and share never-before-heard stories with a true crime twist. It sounds innocent enough, except that there's already a podcast called The Pretty Little Podcast, which has been out for a couple of years and goes over every episode of Pretty Little Liars and is hosted by two sisters, Caroline and Phoebe, who enjoy watching Pretty Little Liars.
Love the name. It just sounds really familiar. Oh my God. It's because it's my podcast name. You see, my sister Phoebe and I have been recording, editing, funding, marketing, everything ourselves for a podcast called The Pretty Little Podcast. For 2 years now. We have over 100 episodes.
So when this new podcast was announced, people were quick to point out that the name was already taken by a very similar podcast. And the existing podcast is hosted by much smaller creators, meaning that when this podcast comes out, it's going to basically make their podcast really hard to find.
Seeing a podcast led by two celebrities with the same name as yours, kind of a bummer, but maybe they're about different things. Of course they're not. They will also be rewatching Pretty Little Liars and recapping it. But instead of pop culture, they will be having some sort of criminal element to it.
So people were quick to say that they've ripped off their name. Even the content is very similar. For example, they go over each episode. So if you see two podcasts with the same name and one of them is on the show, you're obviously going to choose the one that's hosted by the celebrities who are on the show.
Each of these women have 1 million followers. That's a built-in audience. They don't have to worry about if they're going to have listeners, if their podcast will be successful, because it will be. Not to mention the amount of help that they have, because their podcast is produced by Podco.
And if you follow Jaclyn Hill, you'll see just what happens when a larger creator creates a brand or a product that has the exact same name as something owned by a smaller creator. It means that all their Google traffic, all their search results will end up resulting in their brand because it's more clicked on and more viewed. And it means that the smaller creator is normally forced to change their name, even if they had it first.
Because right now, when you Google Pretty Little Podcast, this is what comes up. That's me and my sister. But once they release one of their episodes, and apparently they've got 12 in the can, you're never going to find us again. Because when you Google Pretty Little Podcast, the celebrity podcast with a built-in audience and a pod network who is there to promote it, yeah, they're going to bury us. Especially because we're talking about the same thing. It's between two nobodies like me and my sister and people who are on the show. Whose do you think you're going to choose?
Though the thing is, these two stars are allowed to have a podcast about the show that they were on. Although it is sad for the smaller creators who had their podcast first, I don't have a problem with them having a podcast, but I think it would have been respectful to have chosen a different name. Tammin and Lindsey even have a whole content team behind their new podcast, so people are questioning how they managed to miss the fact that the name was already taken by a very similar podcast, considering it would only take a quick Google search to find their podcast. One of the sisters then reached out to try and clear things up, only to be told that the name couldn't be changed.
I reached out saying, LOL, great minds think alike. Maybe there's a collab in our future. And that is the only message we have ever sent them. Now, if you go try to look at this post now, you won't find any of these comments that I'm about to show you because this podcast company has the funds to pay someone to go and delete all the negative comments that they get. But they can't pay someone to do a quick Google search to see if a podcast name has already been taken.
People weren't just posting on the new podcast page, they were posting on the actresses' Instagrams as well.
Really, they're just urging them to consider changing their name, considering they don't have any released episodes yet. I mean, there are pages and pages of these, and we are so grateful.
Although the actress's response to this was that this podcast had been months in the making, and that they'd already produced a lot of content with this as their name, which meant it wasn't just as easy as changing the name on the Instagram page, because the fact that they were hosted by a company makes it sound like the company had already invested a lot into this being their name, making the situation a little bit more complex.
Once the comments got a little too loud, a little too hard to ignore, Tammin started responding, saying things like, It goes through a network that has nothing to do with us. But then she changed her tune. She started saying she would have us on the show because they love their fans. Girl, who said we were fans of you? And then the showrunner messages us. Hey, this is one of the show producers. So glad you're fans of PLL. Could be fun for our host to share what it was like working on the show. We know there's been some confusion about the name. To be honest, we didn't know there was another show with this name. Too late to change it on our end because we have a whole production team behind it. But it's all good because it's a totally different show. We have true crime detectives and are interviewing the rest of the cast of PLL. Like, you guys could come on an episode if you want. No confusion about the name here. Been using it for 2 years. To be honest, we didn't know there was another show with this name. So typically you would Google to see if there's one, especially with that huge whole production team behind it. Too late to change it now. You haven't released any episodes. It's actually the perfect time. I need to point out, nowhere in this message, in my message, in their message, was there anything about like us saying, let's have a podcast swap? I just want to make that clear. So in an effort to save their asses, I guess, they pinned this comment on their original post introducing the podcast. Hey, show producer here. To the people in the comments upset about the name, fear not. The Pretty Little Podcast wrote us in our DMs asking us to do a podcast swap, and we think it's a wonderful idea. Well, our show is certainly much different. The actual actresses from the show talking about their real-life experiences behind the scenes, plus forensics experts and detectives talking about actual true crime stories. We'd love to give them as much love as we can. Anyone who's a fan of PLL, we're happy to give some flowers to and promote. Unless, of course, that means they have to hold themselves accountable. Literally just like not true. So in an effort to control the narrative, I responded. Just said, looks like there's some confusion. We didn't suggest a podcast swap, but it's an interesting idea. We'll get back to your DM as soon as we can. You know, at first glance, doing a podcast swap, yeah, at first glance, that sounds amazing. Like the exposure we could get. Again, I mentioned that built-in audience earlier. Like it would be great. Unfortunately, ethically, that's not something I can do. And I'm not comfortable with people thinking that I reached out suggesting that. When I said collab, I literally was like, maybe they'll post about us on their Instagram story. Like, I didn't know I was in crisis. But nowhere did I say pod swap. As far as I'm concerned, they just invited themselves onto our show. Invite only, biatch.
That was until the new show and host continued to be bombarded with messages, with people calling them out for copying their name, to the extent that they even started deleting comments.
So when we didn't immediately jump on that, they deleted all the comments. Like literally deleted every single comment that was in support of us. Any comment that acknowledged that like they made a mistake. They even deleted the comments like talking about us reaching out and asking for a pod swap.
It was definitely starting to get a bit messy until in the end, thanks to the backlash, Tammin announced that they'll be changing the name of their podcast to Pretty Little Liars True Crime, doing a 180 on the previous statement saying that they were unable to change the name.
I firstly wanted to get on here and thank you so much for being fans of the show. If it wasn't for you guys, we would never have gotten to do this show, and to still be talking about it this many years later is just absolutely incredible. And it's because of you guys, and we love you so much. I also want to talk about the name of our show being similar to another name of a podcast, and I just wanted to say that we had no idea until about 2.5 days ago, but we hear you and we know that you're disappointed, and we want to make sure that you feel heard and validated, and we are going to change our name to Pretty Little Liars True Crime because our show is vastly different. We want to make sure the other show gets everything that they want out of their show, and ours is very different. We have crew and cast members from the original Pretty Little Liars come on the show, talk about their experience, and we have the rest of the show talking about true crime as it relates to Pretty Little Liars. So our new name is called Pretty Little Liars True Crime, and yes, go listen to all the Pretty Little Liars podcasts. We love that you're still interested in the show, and yeah, hopefully we can have you guys on the show, our fans, talking about what you love, what you wanted to know, any behind the scenes secrets, and we're really excited, and again, we are so grateful for all of you. Mwah!
So it seems like it all ended up working out, and the hosts of the original show were very grateful.
Thank you so much to Tammin and Sursok for posting this comment and changing the name. They are changing the name of their podcast to Pretty Little Liars True Crime. I did not think this would happen. Phoebe and I were not thinking that we would actually even have like an end result. So this is crazy and extremely meaningful. Thank you for doing the right thing and realizing that it matters. Small content creators, small businesses should be able to stand up for themselves. Thank you for being part of the solution. I know this got messy, and I'm sorry for that.
And to be fair, the drama has given more spotlight to the original podcast. However, while some people are praising Tammin for making the change, some people are saying that they shouldn't have had to change their name, considering it is the name of the show that they were both on, and instead sided with Tammin when she said that as actresses on the show, they should be allowed to use the podcast name that involves the words Pretty Little. With one of Tammin's original comments reading, "Hi beautiful fans. A few of you have made comments, and so I'm going to say a few things. We actually did not know the name was similar to another show since the last few days. I've also been made aware that there are many PLL rewatch shows out there. I actually love that for fans. We have recorded over 3 months of episodes with the original cast plus built sets, contracts, approval, etc., so the name can't be changed. That being said, we have extended and reached out to the other show. I personally have said they should come on, meet some cast, help us build their show. As fans of a series, I would assume this would be helpful and a wonderful experience. I've heard from some of you that this has been rejected. I also want to state that as original cast members of the show we were on for 8 years, we were allowed to create a show for our fans with the words Pretty Little Liars in some form in the title. I'm not sure if some words were moved around that it would appease the other show. Our show is not the same show. It's half true crime and half original crew. Definitely interesting that after only a couple of days, they did end up changing the name of the podcast after receiving enough backlash, but other fans are saying that they shouldn't have had to. With one of the most liked comments reading, "It's honestly bizarre to me that someone who wasn't at all a part of the show would take it upon themselves to name their podcast something so similar though. They should have left it to the cast. I'm excited for your podcast regardless, and a new name is fantastic." Others even accused the original podcast girls of being a little bit aggressive in their stance, writing, "Love the idea of your show. Really sucked to see the other podcast get so nasty over a name. You definitely handled the situation a lot better. Although it kind of sucks that you had to change the name, good for you for being the bigger people. Really hope you don't put any more energy into a relationship with a smaller pod and get them on the show, or anything like you mentioned a while back." And then someone who works for the production company decided to leave a comment as well, although I think that this doesn't represent the views of the company, just the individual.
Did you get mad at actors from the show starting a podcast about the show? Why don't you change your podcast name to Petty Little Podcasters? You'd have endless content. By the way, he has both of his employers in his Instagram bio at this point, the Hive Media Group and the Podco. And this really pissed me off because, bitch, I have not been petty yet.
And to be fair, Pretty Little Podcast isn't necessarily the most original name, considering it's just a play on the words Pretty Little Liars, which the sisters don't own. But at least it seems to have all worked out in the end. So let me know in the comments what you think about this. Do you think it's good that the original podcast managed to get the new podcast to change its name? Or do you think that the name's not original enough and you should have been able to keep the new podcast name? Please like this video if you enjoyed,